Hey everyone, this is my response to article discussion number 4. I read the Nachlan work, The Imaginary Orient, as well as African Art at Stanford University. So the first article to talk about, I agree with Brian. I found it really enjoyable, but definitely struggled to figure out what the author's main point was throughout the reading, though I think the conclusive paragraphs really highlight that a little bit more. I always appreciate when authors kind of begin with a summary of previous scholarship and other thoughts and opinions that have been stated in the topic that they're covering. Previous analysis specifically brought up was one by Donald Rosenthal, and kind of more of a discussion in terms of how he definitely brings up important issues, but then doesn't expand upon them. So my initial interpretation of the point of the article was that this author would be expanding upon them. They focused on the Jean-Léon Gérôme, probably butchering that pronunciation, apologies, and his work. So the snake charmer, or what it should be called as the snake charmer in his audience, was a focus, and I found it really interesting to kind of see Nachlan's discussion of like how these artists consider themselves realist and my understanding of realism. I guess that's an era in the isms or the 20th century that we haven't gotten to yet. So realism to me feels more like trying to show real life, and the realism that was used here is more showing realistic things, but maybe not in a realistic setting. Like it wasn't like, an exact moment represented in art. It's more just like exact items represented in a fictional scene of some kind, though then later on, it seems like the artist did also use a lot of photographs for reference to kind of defend their position of being realists. The author also brings up Delacroix and the death of Sardanapalus, and kind of, there is a lot of realistic qualities, but the scene isn't completely realistic, and there's definitely artistic liberties. And so I think it's also a really important point made by the author that, this grouping of artists who are creating this work is the same society, as it is quoted, that was engaged in wiping out local customs and traditional practices, was also avid to preserve them in the form of records, verbal, musical, linguistics, and visual. So there's a really interesting conversation to have here about how this Orient, or the East, is being preserved in artwork, but is also being equally as destroyed, which I feel like maybe is the ultimate point of this reading, is how both things were accomplished. And then the final, conclusive part of this reading was, kind of talking about how to handle this art from two very opposite spectrums. The first being in like a celebratory manner, and the other only being considered the like major masterpieces. And the author says this is wrong. These pieces are worth studying not because they're necessarily great pieces of art, but because they are almost like documenting history. The author also gives us permission to continue to analyze these works, as we now have a historical and political awareness as well as analytical sophistication. So I really feel like this entire article definitely points out problems within paintings created of what was called the Orient. To be honest, I still feel like that word, like primitivism or primitive, just has a negative connotation when we think about like European colonization and this like very over the top intrigue with works outside of the Western world. And so I'm not really sure whether that phrasing is appropriate or what the author thinks of that. This is kind of another discussion similar to what we had last week in terms of the word primitive. So overall, I thought this was an important work as it examined artists I had never heard of before, and gave us kind of permission to continue forth the line of inquiry that the author actually established. Going forward from there, the African art at Stanford University was really interesting as well. I wasn't really aware that what was originally the Leland Stanford Junior Museum, of course, was ruined a few times in earthquakes, had such a massive collection of non-Western art. I mean, by the end of its lifetime in its current state, it has a Rodin sculpture garden, arts of Africa, Asia, South Pacific, South Asia, Oceania, Native American, Ancient Americans, as well as some European and American paintings. The author of this article definitely gave a lot of chronological information about how a lot of works from around the African continent were gained and then put into the collection. The author also went through a couple of different people and their, positions as director or curators and how they influenced this. So originally, this museum was supposed to be focusing on work from other continents, and to be a survey museum. And so throughout its history, of course, earthquake doing damage in 1906, and, the need to recatalog and re-itemize a lot of different artifacts. I think Harry C. Peterson worked from 5 a.m. to 8 p.m., 7 days a week for 6 months, cataloging 28,200 items, which is absolutely insane. We saw the expansion of Southwest American pottery by Pedro de Lemos, and a lot of 18th and 19th century artwork, Rodin, Muybridge, and Asian art by Lorenz Eitner. It seems like in the 1970s is when the African Studies program was expanded over there, but it didn't feel like it was done very successfully, and that embarrassment sort of led to like a quieting in terms of pursuing more public programs concerning African art. But it seems like the first example of African art on permanent display, though there was previous African art in that collection, was done by Victor Zurcher. So that was awesome to see. It seems like the museum as a whole went through a really huge change, but still within the mission and goal of being a survey museum and including art from all over the world. In 1989, when the earthquake just ruined some of the reinforced concrete of the structure of the building, and a lot of repairs needed to be made. It was closed for almost 10 years. And during that time, a director, Thomas K. Seligman, was just the most outstanding man to have been chosen for the job. He had such an intense background in African art, being the director of Africana Museum in Liberia, traveling a lot throughout the world, having a lot of say and influence in terms of the repatriation and, display and, public awareness of arts from Africa. There was a lot of, attempt at trying to expand the museum's holdings geographically as well as chronologically. And the end result when it reopened is just such a expansive history. The article talked about how the gallery spaces were designed to reflect areas that would really fit well with the works being displayed. The placards and explanation cards providing more background about the people, about the culture, and these labels kind of giving context and meaning to the work for people who visited, as well as a gallery introduction providing a broader perspective. So reading this entire passage, I can see how the support for this work from other areas of the world kind of just really was, it persevered throughout all the iterations of this museum. It never waned. And that I think is a really special quality that has, existed until today. And so I kind of feel that same thing from the Imaginary Orient reading, where this author, is definitely celebrating and supporting work from non-Western areas of the world, and trying to do so by providing context and understanding for each of these different examples, whether it be a single object of or a painting of an object or scene, or the actual object itself in the case of the Stanford Museum. So generally speaking, I felt like this was a really positive discussion and article, at least in pairing to read together. Very different, so I'm not sure how many like comparisons there are to make between the two, but still very important all the same to kind of see how these types of artwork were received both immediately and in a more, historical genre narrative painting sense from the European perspective, as well as a lot of people who wanted to make sure that this artwork is still available for museum visitors to see and understand and appreciate. So can't wait to hear what everybody else thought on these readings, whether it was the Stanford one or maybe the Imaginarian. All right, everybody. Bye.